On this real economy, does the government have to do more to get financial institutions, for example, to readjust rates, to write down loans? Have they done enough on that front?
They certainly could do more. I mean, in terms of reducing rates and reducing rates around mortgages, they've made a serious push there. The problem is that credit quality is deteriorating. People are losing jobs, and you can't just tell the banks to push out money, lend to people irrespective,
right,
because that's not going to work either. Really, what you have to do is find ways to limit the job losses and to strengthen banks so that as the recovery begins, hopefully, sometime next year, I think it's going to come, but it'll be anemic initially. Hopefully the banks will have enough capital, they'll be able to make loans and support that recovery. But it's going to be tough for a while.
West Palm Beach, Florida, good morning. Republican caller.
Hi, good morning.
Morning.
My question is for Mr. Johnson. I've been watching CNBC, for instance, for a number of years, and every time someone gets up on there, and they're giving their recommendations, they say, well, this person holds that stock or doesn't hold that stock personally or through trusts and funds and whatnot. And the revolving door kind of practice that goes on that you were discussing earlier, I find a little distressing. I've wondered why it is that we don't have something similar for when a bill gets pushed through Congress or through the Senate, where on that bill you see that these people received money from AIG, from this corporation or that corporation. I think that the transparency that we get on CNBC just from simple recommendations, I mean, that seems to be going a step further than policy. And I think policy is a lot more important, personally, than one guy's interpretation of what's a good buy or good sell on, CNBC. And I was wondering what your thoughts might be on something like that.
Well, I think more transparency and disclosure is absolutely essential, and I think the Obama administration has moved some distance towards this, but they can and should do more, particularly all the people who are around the White House who don't go through the confirmation process. I would say, perhaps I'm too cynical, I would say whenever I hear people on CNBC, and I think it's a very, very informative, helpful channel, I just assume they're talking their book. I assume that when they're promoting and advocating certain positions, that's the way that they've invested. Now, perhaps it would be good to have a more formal disclosure of that, but I think we should all have our eyes open and be suitably skeptical of all the advice and positions you hear, including, I suppose, from myself. And we do on my website, baselinescenario.com, we do tell people what our investment positions are.
I was going to ask you, a viewer wrote in, there are so many contradicting views on the current situation. How does the layman sort out which ones are giving correct advice? And you mentioned your website. It's what's it called again?
Baseline Scenario, all one word, .com, or you can just search for my name, Simon Johnson, in Google. This is what comes up.
In looking at your website this morning, you have a piece on there on understanding how the crisis came about. And you wrote that while the U.S. housing bubble played a role in the formation of crisis and continued housing problems remain an issue, the boom was, and the bust is, much broader. This is a synchronized debt-financed global boom facilitated by flows of capital around the world. So it's much broader than the U.S. housing market being the instigator of this.
Absolutely, and unfortunately. Now, obviously, U.S. housing was the proximate cause and very much involved in what happened in the last 5 years. But we want to go back and suggest people go back 20 or 30 years and look at the way that debt increased, look at how banking activity became more important around the world. And this, then, is what you see, that it wasn't just housing, it wasn't just in the United States, it's much more general. In fact, it's across most of apart from the U.S., most other industrialized countries, including much of Western Europe.
The Americans have seen a lot of Ben Bernanke, the Federal Reserve Chair, in hearings, in a recent 60 Minutes appearance, and here you have a full piece in yesterday's Outlook section of the Washington Post. The headline is "The Radicalization of Ben Bernanke." What's the point of this op-ed?
Well, the point is that Ben Bernanke is taking extraordinary steps that we regard as being very risky with regard to supporting credit and putting more money into the economy. We're supportive. Okay, but that's because we think the alternatives are quite dire. We think that the economy could become much worse, but we want people to have their eyes open to the fact that it could well also create serious inflation in this country. So we're trying to be sort of honest and explain his intellectual development and why he's pushing for these policies, and why we think also you should think of it as a dangerous but sensible policy stance to take.
What are sort of the flags that he'll see, that the Fed will see, for inflation that will cause them concern and get them to change their course?
Well, traditionally, you would look for indicators that unemployment was falling and that capacity was being used up in the economy, right? That's the standard way of thinking about inflation in the U.S. All of those indicators point down. All of those indicators say there'll be less inflation and maybe even deflation, so falling wages and prices. But we suggest that what they may see more directly is prices moving up. So even though the real economy is getting worse and unemployment is going up, you may see movements in producer prices or in consumer prices directly. In the UK, for example, where they're following a similar policy to Ben Bernanke, they're seeing some what they call surprise jumps in inflation. I don't think they're surprising at all. It's a feature, again, of the kind of structure of the economy that we've created. We've become much more like a middle-income emerging market country. So we used to think that the US was very different from a Korea or an Argentina or a Brazil. I think now we're much more similar.
Let's hear from Warfordsburg, Pennsylvania, on our Independence line for Simon Johnson. Hi there.
Hi. First of all, I've never seen a privatization that really benefited people and didn't increase prices for us. But my question is that nationalization versus bankruptcy. I think that nationalization means that the U.S. would assume these bad debts of these banks, whereas in bankruptcy, we get rid of the bad debts. So don't we want bankruptcy versus nationalization?
Well, I think to answer your question, which is a very, very good question, there may be a difference between nationalization and bankruptcy along the lines that you indicate, that you would in nationalization protect all the creditors, protect everyone who's lent to the banks. But I would stress you don't have to do that. I mean, it really depends on how you implement nationalization. And I think this term nationalization is quite a distraction. I think what we're talking about is various forms of government-managed bankruptcy process. The point being that you can't push these big banks into Chapter 11, make them go through the courts because you fear the consequence of that, and also because there's no bankruptcy financing available on the scale necessary to keep these banks going, and you don't necessarily want to have them collapse and liquidate everything immediately. So if you're talking about government-managed bankruptcy process, you are absolutely talking about who will take what kinds of losses. And you're trying to weigh up the equity issues, the issues you don't want to put in too much taxpayer money, against issues of how scary it is, basically, to the system if you let this or that type of creditor lose money or potentially fail. So I think it's all a very practical discussion, not at all ideological, although I understand some people want to make it ideological.
And Secretary Geithner was asked yesterday on Face the Nation about the possibility of taking over banks. I wanted to play his comments and get your reaction.
When in the future, or obviously if in the future, banks need exceptional assistance in order to get through this, then we'll make sure that assistance comes with conditions not just to protect the taxpayer, but to make sure there's the kind of restructuring necessary for them to emerge stronger. And where that requires a change in management of the board, we'll do that.
You will
where that's
do
necessary,
that.
where it meets the test, where it's necessary to do what we're here exists to do, which is to make sure that this financial system supports recovery and the banks emerge stronger.
Simon Johnson, what did you hear there?
I think that was a very good statement. That's what the kind of thing that we've been pressing for over the past few months, which is to be tough with the bankers while you're trying to save the banking system. And I think the example and the parallel is with what happened to General Motors, where the government found that the CEO was not being cooperative, and they suggested that he leave. Last week, Robert Wagner left that position. Now, having the government replace CEOs directly is like taking a very blunt stick to this problem. Much better is, because we're the major shareholder in some of these banks already, to change some people who are on the board of directors and work through boards of directors to make sure you've got the appropriate management in there. And I think actually that was where what Secretary Geithner was more or less communicating.
Let's go to Willman, Minnesota, on our Democrats line. Hi there.
Hi. How you doing?
You're on with us. Go ahead.
Okay. I think there's two simple things that you people should be telling us people. First of all, when we take polls, most people think that the government just prints money it needs. Well, that's absolutely false, because we have a debt of $9 trillion. So please tell the people that the government does not print money. And the other thing is, you should tell them how money is created. It's created when banks make loans. And I read that the Citibank has loans, assets they call them, and they're good assets. They pay interest of $4.4 trillion. Now, those are the simple things you need to tell people, so we don't. People. You ask 10 people, what is the government doing that needs more money than it has? it prints more money. Well, that's you have the means of telling people that's not true, and you have the means of telling people how money is actually created. Thank you.